Hi, I'm Randy. I'm going to tell you about our work, Curated Personas and Design Guidelines tool for better supporting diverse end users. It's work done with my students, Jianming, Jia, Jun, Xingyun, Zichun, and my colleague Tangela. First of all, I'll talk about the motivation for this work. I'll outline uses of personas in software engineering, talk about the research methods that we used, give you a summary of some of our key results, and talk about future work. So key motivation for this work is that end users of our software systems have many diverse challenges. These include, but are certainly not limited to, sight. So a number of users have color blindness, blurred vision, like me, tunnel vision, and some have no sight at all. Some of these issues are required during lifetime, and some of them users are born with. A number of users have hearing impairment. They either can't hear at all, or their hearing is impaired, and any apps or websites heavily using sound are difficult for them to use. Many users have different cognitive challenges or mental processes. So this includes ADHD, neurodiverse users, people with dyslexia, dyscalculia, short-term memory impairment, and so on. So again, websites and apps that don't take this into account may be very difficult for these users. Some users have motor skill impairment. So again, they don't have precise movement for controlling a mouse, a trackpad, or gesture. Some users have language challenges in terms of the spoken and written language they use, the jargon they understand, cultural norms around meanings, etc. And there are many others. If our apps and websites are not designed with some of these issues in careful consideration, they're extremely difficult to use or even impossible to use for many of these user groups. Now, developers are usually very different, don't have these challenges or have a very restricted subset of them. They often don't have the skills or experience to design for these user groups. What we want to do in this work, and it's part of a larger body of work that we're undertaking in my Humanized Lab, is how can we better support developers to understand some of these key challenges their users have, be aware of and follow design guidelines for such end users that have been produced, and carry out evaluations of their apps and websites to see whether users with some of these challenges are suitably supported and the challenges addressed. So when we develop a website or an app, there are a number of things that we can do to help keep in mind diverse end user challenges. We can include users with these challenges in our focus groups, design groups, co-creation groups, etc. However, there's a huge range of potential end users this covers. Recruiting them and engaging them can be very time-consuming, very expensive. And we, of course, might still not include some challenging user groups and not identify and suitably address their issues. Another way is to use personas. So personas have been used in many contexts. They can include a single challenge or potentially multiple. And they can be used to help us design our websites and apps, but also evaluate them. Lots of studies have been done and published that use different end user groups and have constructed personas to represent them. Lots of industrial guidelines for different end user groups exist. And a range of personas, design guidelines, and evaluation checklists may help developers to keep in mind these different user groups, follow existing best practices, and assist them during the development of their software. Now, keep in mind, personas don't replace real end users, but they can be a complement to assist developers. So personas are representations of users. We've got an example here on the right. There's a set of demographics, a set of goals, if you like, a set of challenges the user has. Typically, we capture a number of goals and frustrations the user has that may be domain specific or might be generic. And we can use a range of different personas to help represent different target end user groups, different ages, genders, education backgrounds, family status, work status, socioeconomic status, and so on. Here's an example that we developed in this work. This is a persona representing a hearing challenged end user. It captures information about her, and including demographics, technology proficiency, and so on, and summarizes some of the challenges that she faces, in this case being profoundly deaf since childhood. And we also capture some sources of information based on previous studies. So for example, here's two of them that we've referred to in this persona, one providing an evaluation framework for deaf web users, and one providing some guidelines around using avatar-based sign language presentations for hearing impaired end users. We also capture some use cases, goals, if you like, and motivations for the users, some of them relating or impacting their challenge, and some of them being perhaps not impacted by their particular challenge. A number of guidelines have been developed and checklists to assist developers. So a couple of them from the studies just mentioned, one of them shown on the right here, with a set of heuristics that can be used when assessing an application for how well or not well it supports hearing impaired users. Many of these developed from empirical studies with real end users. Some of them are informed by medical studies of people that have particular physical and mental challenges. A number of them have been developed in industrial practice and codified as, if you like, best practices to follow as a developer of an app or website for a particular challenged end user group. And some of them have checklists that can be followed by designers or evaluators to go through an application and check that it is suitably addressing challenges of that end user group. Again, on the right, there's a set of heuristics from a study, and another example here of using a set of heuristics to evaluate a couple of example websites to see if they meet the heuristics or not. In our research approach, we wanted to focus on two very prominent areas, e-education and e-commerce, that have become even more commonly used during the pandemic. So even more diverse end users are more heavily using such technologies. We wanted to identify a range of diverse end user challenges that we wanted to target in our work and build personas for. So we identified the needs of the representative set of end users. We constructed personas based on their needs. We then built a prototype tool that could be used by developers, and giving them a set of guidelines to follow. And we validated that our tool worked for developers and evaluators with a number of real-world practitioners. Just a diagrammatic summary of that: we identified our two domains, e-education and e-commerce. We identified a number of challenges we wanted to support, a number of personas we built, curated from the literature. We built up a set of motivations and frustrations for these personas. Excuse me. And built a set of design guidelines. We developed a tool. We evaluated the tool. And we refined our prototype and personas based on that developer feedback. Here's a set of the challenges we focused on in this work. We looked at users with hearing impairment or working in a noisy environment. So any applications making heavy use of sound, they would find challenging. We looked at users that had colour blindness and therefore applications that used colour didn't support them were problematic. We looked at users with myopia or with challenges to their vision caused by things like conjunctivitis, so made it blurry or uncomfortable. And again, applications requiring precision or long attention spans could be problematic. Looked at age-related issues, so for quite senior users and quite young users. We looked at cognitive issues, so where users had some level of memory impairment or cognition difficulties, limited literacy, and very different cultural differences. So again, use different language or jargon or different kind of behavioural norms. I looked at some physical impacts on using apps and websites, such as unsteady hands or even not being able to use an arm. And we looked at a few other related issues where, for example, an app had to run on a variety of platforms, particularly older ones for socioeconomically disadvantaged users who couldn't buy the latest handset. And again, people who had low speed internet connections, again, probably due to socioeconomic issues. These are by no means comprehensive, of course. There's many other end user challenges and end user groups out there. These are the ones we looked at in particular in this work. So we did a large scale literature search, found a number of personas, and we built our own personas based on those to represent e-commerce and e-education app users. We had a range of demographics, we had a range of use cases, a range of frustrations in those particular e-commerce and e-education domains that we needed to address. We came up with some potential guidelines to be used for the particular end user challenges we identified, and we backed up the guidelines with sources of those. So many of these published literature, so peer-reviewed academic literature, but many are also industrial best practices that have been codified and described. So the design guidelines give a set of steps to try and follow, and each of those is backed up by one or more references to more detailed resources that could be used by developers. We then built a prototype tool where we turned each persona into two versions, one for e-education application development, one for e-commerce application development. We turned the guidelines into two forms of checklists, one for designers or developers and the other for evaluators. So they're phrased slightly differently and presented in different ways for those two different audiences. And the tool embodied these. So an example here, our persona, goals, motivations, frustrations summarized, and instead of recommended guidelines, those can then be clicked on and the resource that it's pointed to hyperlinked and more detail found by the user. We carried out an evaluation of our tool. So we recruited 23 software developers. We showed them a video of our tool in use on each of the education and e-commerce domains. We gave them the tool to use if they had the time and wanted to experiment with it. We asked for feedback on its usefulness or perceived feedback on the usefulness of the approach, how it might integrate with their work practices. And we asked for feedback on different features of the tool and recommendations for further enhancements. Most of our end users were reasonably favourable to the tool. Many highlighted that the presentations are somewhat complex and there's a lot of guidelines, recommendations, checklists provided. So some form of filtering or prioritization or simplification would be necessary to make it practically useful and accessible. There's some issue was flagged with the idea that the personas, each of the personas represented a single issue, and of course many people have multiple challenges at the same time, and how these interact with each other and what are the more important ones for a particular website or app usage might be different to individual ones. And many thought that it would be useful to be able to tailor the personas to the particular domain they're working on. So to give them, more precise demographics, more precise goals, frustrations, perhaps filter again some of the guidelines and checklists for the particular target domain and persona usage. So on this, we identified some further work needed. Again, reduce the reliance on large amounts of text in the personas and guidelines, prioritize them perhaps. So what are the most important things to address for users of a particular challenge? Again, validating the collated personas and the issues highlighted and the guidelines suggested with real end users of each challenge. Support combining multiple user challenges into single personas, and also trial these personas in different domains to e-commerce and education. Some of our developers indicated that how they would integrate this into their own development environment was not clear. So it's important to be able to integrate such a tool with existing development tool chains. And it would also be useful for the wider development community to be able to contribute new personas, guidelines, checklists, modify existing ones, and so on to the curated persona library that's embodied in the tool. So in summary, when designing and evaluating websites for challenging users, developers are faced with many challenging issues. They're usually quite different to their end users. They haven't lived the particular challenges many of them have. They may not be trained or may not be familiar with how to address those challenges. Personas are often used as an aid in requirements gathering, design, and evaluation. So it's a concept that many developers have at least some familiarity with. We curated a large number of these from published literature. We collated a number of guidelines that have been produced to guide developers, designers, evaluators when designing for particular end user challenge groups. We formulated these as a set of checklists to be used by developers and evaluators when developing websites and apps for the e-commerce and e-education domains. We built a tool to support the use of our curated personas by developers and evaluators. We had 23 real-world developers provide us feedback on our approach. And there's a number of interesting future work directions that we'd like to explore further to make software more accessible for diverse users. Well, thank you very much for listening. Please go and read our paper. I'd like to thank the Australian Research Council for supporting myself and Tangilla doing this work, and thank colleagues in the Human Rights Lab for their support for this work as well. Thank you very much.